Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Emergency Home Learning Summit. Our special guest today is Gina Riley. Gina, welcome.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Gina, what do you do? What's your job?
I am in two very distinct worlds. So, for most of my life, I run an adolescent special education program at CUNY Hunter College. I'm a clinical professor there, and I teach New York City school teachers. And in the other side of my life, as a researcher, I research self directed learning, intrinsic motivation, homeschoolers, and unschoolers. So I really do straddle two worlds.
You do, and we're going to have fun getting there. What was your story of school growing up?
School was something that I didn't know I had a choice to do. I went to school. I was a pretty high achiever. My mother is a guidance counselor, a school guidance counselor. So I grew up in a family of educators where education is really important. The learning, not so much, but the education and the achievement that comes from education was really important. I went to college. I went to my first year of college at SUNY Albany and loved it, but ended up not seeing the value or the worth in, I just had to figure out who I was. So I left. I actually had a baby, was a single mom, and then went back to college feeling like it was really the choice I had to make so that my child could have a good life. And that was an interesting choice for me. It led me to graduate school. It led me to get my PhD. But really, the motivation to do that was because I had this child and I was making alternative education choices for this child, and I really needed to validate those choices in some way. So my research has led me to validate the untraditional choices I made, and I'm always very thankful for that.
Uh, How have your parents reacted to your shifting your story?
At first, probably poorly. When I left college, of course, there was a lot of anger and there was a lot of like, what are you doing with your life? And when I went back to college, there was a lot of what's next, what's next, what's next. And that's fine. We have come to terms with it. My parents are now great, great fans of homeschooling and unschooling and alternative education because their grandson has been in that unschooling space. They were very doubtful at first. They were very doubtful until he got into college, graduated from college, and went on to grad school. But now I think the whole family is really like gung ho about self directed learning and knows it works because they've seen it work.
So, this is interesting, right? There's an emotional response people have both to others and internally when you do something that's not what people consider to be the standard activity. Why is that, especially in schooling and learning?
Yeah, well, we know from research, and I know from my personal life, that when you make a decision about school and education that is untraditional, people get really defensive. Most of the world goes to school. Most of the world sees this as a very traditional structure. It has been traditional for a while. And why would you part from that? And so, I mean, I get the disbelief and I get the why isn't your kid going on the bus, right? Because I've experienced that. And I just think it's anything, anytime you're doing something different, making a different choice, you're going to have some pushback on that choice. And for many alternatively learning parents, the pushback is quite deep. The one good thing that's come out of this pandemic, I think, is the greater acceptance of alternative education options. When you're in it, you don't see what's not working, right? Because you're in it and you're doing it every day. And then when the world stops and you're outside that space, And suddenly you're into a space you don't know, whether it be remote learning or homeschooling. There's a time where you look at things differently. And I think this has really been the time where we've had to stop and pause and look at things differently and say, gosh, we did this every day, but maybe it wasn't working for us. Or gosh, we did this every day and I miss it and I want to go back.
So I'm wondering if this is kind of a universal experience, but it's the first time we're experiencing it in a larger way in schools, right? Because those who do alternative health practices, or those who um, have become foodies and think outside of the traditional food system, they're probably in similar circumstances, but there's something about education. It's almost like education is at the core of all of these other ways that we think. And so I'm wondering about the internal practice that someone would go through if the voices in their own head are hard, meaning, okay, I'm a student or I'm a parent, and I'm suddenly thinking about what do I actually do in this moment? And if I don't have guideposts, how do I trust myself in that moment?
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking and there's a lot of really changing a mind view and a world view. What do I really believe in? What do I really want to do? How do I take steps to change what I was doing to create a new reimagined world for myself? Anytime you're shifting, right? Whether it's you're choosing a type of parenting style, or you're choosing a type of nutrition style, or you're choosing a type of schooling style, there's a lot that goes into that. In the unschooling world, we talk about deschooling. And so deschooling is a process, and it's a process for both parent and child, where there is really a need to rethink those culturally ingrained feelings about schooling and learning. So the parent will go through a deschooling process and think about things like, what is achievement? What is learning? What looks like success and what isn't? And then a child will just go through a period of like, oh, I get to be home. So what does that mean for me? Do I get to like rest or play video games all day? Do I get to just do whatever I want? And what is that? And how do I even get started in it and do that? So, in the deschooling process for both parent and child, there's a lot of questioning. And that questioning is good because it leads to a shift, as we know in both nutrition and schooling.
So you said that your parents' story of education had been for education and achievement, but not so much the learning, or at least that was the story you grew up with. And you're working with teachers every day. Are schools for learning?
That's a hard question for me because, again, I'm in a space where I want to be fully supportive of what my teachers are doing all the time. My teachers are heroes. They really, really want the best for their kids. They really do. And so when we ask the question, are schools for learning, to teachers, we'll get mixed reactions. They want it to be for learning, but something about the structure, something about the rules that surround the structure may not make it the most conductive place for learning. So for example, when you have, a classroom of same aged kids, as adults, we don't learn from people of the same age. We learn from all different kinds of people. And so sometimes that classroom structure affects things. And then, of course, you have this whole notion of a lot of schools work on a system of positive behavioral supports. And so when you're talking about positive behavior supports, you're talking about you do something for me and I will give you a reward, right? We're not talking about the more intrinsic, do something because it's important for you. So schools can be, for some individuals, great spaces and places for learning. And I'm thinking of individuals who may not have a specific home or family situation where learning can happen in any way. But for other kids, school might be not the most conducive to learning because there's so much outside of the structure that can be created. And so again, hard, really difficult question. My teachers, again, will do everything they can to have their kids love learning and to have their kids really, want to learn. But it's hard to do within that structure sometimes.
What was the moment for you when your thinking really shifted?
My child was born. Um, it's it was literally a transformational moment. It was the moment I looked at my child and said, okay, we're going to do things differently. We were in a different situation anyway. I was a single mother. I was raising this child alone. I didn't want the stereotypes of, the child doesn't have a father to stay with him for the rest of his life. I wanted to make him be his own person. And so as he grew, I just watched and I really learned from this kid. I mean, he was a toddler. I watched him explore. He was a preschooler. I watched him get really into rocks and minerals, which I thought was so funny, right? Like it's very, very cute. But then he was asking about chemical composition and he was asking about periodic table. And he was 5 years old. And I'm thinking, oh, something different is going on here. And so it was really my child that made me rethink structures of education, education itself. What is learning? What does this all mean? And how am I going to create an environment that's okay for him?
So, one of the fascinating things about parenthood is that you come face to face with a dilemma. And the dilemma is you're trying to help your child become self motivated. But how do you influence another person to be self motivated? What have your studies shown?
Yeah. So I have always been a huge fan of Edward Deci and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester. And all my academic life, I've studied self-determination theory and cognitive evaluation theory. So fancy names, big ideas, right? Self-determination theory is all about intrinsic motivation, is all about doing what you love, doing what you want to do because it's internally motivating for you. And then cognitive evaluation theory is all about facilitating an environment that promotes intrinsic motivation. So again, you can't force intrinsic motivation, right? Because that would be extrinsic. But you can facilitate an environment where intrinsic motivation surrounds the person or the class or the child. And you do this, as Deci and Ryan says, by facilitating three things. The first is a sense of competence. All kids and teens need to know that they can do things, that they are competent, that they have strengths, and that they are allowed to run with those strengths and feelings of competence. So the competence part is really important. The second part of this is autonomy. Students, kids, teens, in whatever environment they're in, need to know that they have freedom and that they have choice. So in the classrooms, we see a lot of choice going on, which is amazing. Some of my students are doing a menu-based approach to education, which really does work. But I mean, kids also know or need to know that they have autonomy. They have freedom. They have the freedom to make choices outside of school, and they have the freedom to make choices inside of school. The scary thing about choice is when you make choices, then you're responsible for those choices. And we sometimes call that the dignity of risk. But students really need to know about that, right? They need to know that they're free to make choices. And once they make a choice, that they are responsible for the outcomes of those choices. And that's huge. I mean, we can talk about choice and responsibility and dignity of risk all day, but it's such a gift to be able to give your child or teen autonomy, a sense of autonomy, an authentic sense of autonomy. The third thing we know is that intrinsic motivation is facilitated by a sense of relatedness, or a sense of knowing there is one person that has your back no matter what. We go back, right? And it's like, if you're a psychology person, it's kind of like humanistic theory, unconditional acceptance, very Carl Rogers, unconditional love. But a kid needs to know they have that, right? Because to make choices, they need to know that even if they make a mistake, someone is still going to unconditionally accept them. They may not like the choice they made, but they will unconditionally have their back and accept them their entire lives. So for me, it's always been about, and for intrinsic motivation and the facilitation of intrinsic motivation, it's always been about that competence, that sense of autonomy, and that sense of relatedness.
Okay, so I want to get pretty real here. So, as the parent of 4 children and 5 grandchildren, that second piece, the autonomy, is fragile. It's hard to create. It took me a long time as a parent to have the confidence internally to provide that for a child. And it feels like in the history of the world, moments of true individual autonomy are small compared to long stretches of control. So, how do you figure that out? It's hard to figure that out as a parent and as a teacher. And then, how do you provide for its replication or its ability to continue?
You practice when kids are little and you keep practicing, right? Autonomy is really a practice. It's not something that we get right all the time. And so, we always talk about the importance of toddlers having choice, right? Would you like this or would you like this? And so that authentic part of that is important. As a child gets older, it's really important that they too have choice. And maybe that choice, and one of the choices the kids make is, do you want to go to school or do you want us to look at some sort of alternative structure? These pockets of autonomy and freedom are so essential, because what happens then is, as teens, you have so many choices. And we know that we want teens to always make the right choices, right? We don't want teens to make choices that may impact their life negatively. We always want teens to make choices that will impact their life positively. But if they haven't had practice with decision making and choice as toddlers or as children, then they're certainly not going to be able to have practice or be able to make choices as adolescents or even young adults. And so I think it's really important that we see all stages of childhood and adolescence as places and spaces for autonomy and choice. And for parents, sometimes it takes practice. Little choices matter. So if you're just starting this, you know, real thinking about autonomy and choice, give little choices, give little pockets of autonomy. And once you do that, you get better and better at the larger sort of autonomy, freedom, choice aspects when a student becomes a teen and a young adult.
Is it fair to say that there are cultures that promote autonomy and others that don't? And so that you're trying to build a culture within your family of intrinsic motivation, autonomy. And then does it become valuable to seek out cultures, school cultures, community cultures that support those beliefs?
I mean, that's an amazing statement, right? In terms of culture, yes, there are some cultures who value autonomy more than others. But I think also, no matter what the background is we are also, as you say, talking about the culture of the family. So within a family system, you create your own culture. And within that culture, you really do have to decide the structures that work for you. And so there are absolutely learning spaces that promote more autonomy and choice than others. And those learning spaces are not just found in, like, the homeschooling or unschooling realm. Those learning spaces are found in, your self-directed learning centers. They're found in your democratic schools. They're found in your public schools that have made the choice to provide intrinsic motivation or some sort of autonomous project-based learning within the structure of their public school, right? I'm thinking the Independence Project at Great Barrington High School, or I'm thinking High Tech High, where it's very project-based and open-spaced. So there are structures all over, both in your public sector, your private sector, and your self-directed learning center, as well as homeschooling and unschooling, where all of this comes together. It's just a matter of we've got to do more to keep building that, right? To keep building that structure of autonomy and choice within schools.
What are the most common questions that those who are in the teacher program ask you about this?
How do we do it given the structure of our school and given administration? There is a lot of fear that if, as a teacher, I do something different, I am going to be punished for that, even though I know it works. And so, if I were to ever say something in terms of statement, administrators, listen to your teachers. They want to be doing more, project-based learning. They want to be doing more things that involve choice and autonomy in their classrooms. They really, really want for their kids to learn and do well, but sometimes they're not given the structures that they can be to succeed. And I get this from an administrator point of view too, right? Administrators need data, and administrators need test scores, and they need good teacher ratings for their schools to thrive. I mean, this is really like, you have to look top down because this is not easy to do. But if we do this, if we really, really, and I think this is the time, if any time is the time, this is the time to do it. If large school districts, if smaller school districts start looking at things like their school culture, their values and mission as a school, and how they can change their classroom spaces to support more intrinsically motivated learning. I mean, this is where the revolution of education comes in, right? And I've always loved your work because it's all been about learning revolution. It's all been about creating this structure throughout the whole world, really, where we can refine and reform what we're doing. And so again, this is the time we can create a pause, and we could go ahead and from the bottom up rebuild structures, rebuild new classroom systems, and really define the role of teachers in learning. I think a lot of my new teachers want to be facilitators of learning. They don't want to be, the authority of learning, because they know that they're not. None of us are. None of us know everything. We could pretend to, we could study whatever we need to and create a lesson plan and do it well and perform it well. But that's not really what my teachers want to be doing. My teachers want to be coaches to their kids. They want to be mentors to their kids. They want to be facilitators of learning for their kids. And the structure right now is stopping them.
One of the arguments in education is that wholesale reform is not possible, that large bureaucratic institutions have their own set of demands and needs. And so what you do is you build a really good secondary story, but you don't expect the wholesale reform to take place. Whereas others feel like we need to figure out learning and then scale it and make it the system. Where do you land in this debate?
Change is always possible. I am one that will never give up on whole system reform. We need it. We can't be doing what we're still doing, right? Like the world has changed and the world has changed dramatically. So obviously the existing structures we had pre-pandemic are changed. They're altered. We've been forced to change. And I've always been, I've always said throughout this whole thing, oh my gosh, this is a horrible thing that's happened to our whole world. And this has been a time of space and thinking and rethinking and restructuring. And I wish that schools can just take a pause. Like, we know remote learning is wonderful. I've been involved in digital learning, in online learning for 20 years. It has amazing pros. But again, it's not serving all, right? We have students who still have poor internet access, who don't have access to computers and are doing remote learning on their phones or on their laptops or on their tablets, and it's not working. And so, we have this system, we've tried to create a new structure, and we have kind of tried to create it in 2 weeks, which I don't think was the smartest thing in the world, but whatever. um, and so we can now pause, take December, take January, pause. Again, we're going to have it. We're going to, probably be in this second wave, and really rethink what education means for this country, really rethink it on a state level, on a city level, on a local school district level, and move forward from there, because our kids deserve it. Right. So it's not enough, although I love self-directed learning centers and I love schools that have really embraced this intrinsically motivated learning trend, which it's not a trend, it's here to stay, right? But it's not enough. We really, really do have to change the structures of education, and we can do it, but we have to buy in. We've got to, because if there's not buy-in, it's just gonna fail.
We're not very good at pausing.
Nope. It's so funny. I talk to my teachers all the time about pacing and pausing, about how silence is a good thing, about how we can take things slower, we can give kids what they need. And it's always a thing that my teachers struggle with and that I struggle with in and of myself. Right? I'm a person that likes action and go and let's do it and let's go. And I'm not good at like, oh my gosh, Steve, what did you just say? Right? And really thinking about that and integrating that. But I think it's time we get good, because I've always said within myself that, and we know this as people, when we don't pause, things make us pause, whether it be illness or sickness or a global pandemic. And so we need to take this seriously. Pause, really think about, like, what did you dream of when you became an administrator? What kind of school did you really want to create? Why did you go into teaching? What kind of classroom do you really want to teach in? And as a parent, why are you sending your kids to school if that's not for them? What kind of structure did you really want for them? To rethink it all, because this is the time. This might be the only time we have in our lifetimes to do it.
That can be really hard to do, and you're facing pressures in lots of other ways. I really liked identifying that the words schooling, training, education, and learning are different, and to recognize that schooling and training are often most of what happens in schools. But taking that pause and thinking long term, in some ways, you feel the pressure that, well, I can't get off track. we're on this track, and it's a schooling and training track, whereas education and learning often take place over the course of years and even decades. There's this sense of a set of expectations, the things I need to do right now to stay on track for my child to get to college, for me to get to college, and then to get a job. Does it help? Your son clearly had his own unique temperament. Does it help to really focus on your individual child and say, I know that I actually care so much about this individual that I'm going to rethink what I do based on their particular temperament and skills and capacities?
I'll never be the person that says that home learning or unschooling or even self-directed learning centers work for everyone. Um, but I also won't ever be the person that says, your child has to be of a particular temperament to succeed. I think it's a balance. I do think that parents do need to look at their whole child. And I say this within the world of education too, right? It's all about whole child learning. It's all about looking at people holistically, whether it be your student or your own child, and really thinking, what does this person in front of me need? What is their best environment for learning? We have this in special ed. It's called least restrictive environment. And if it's a law, and if we do it well, we can really change, the world, right? If we thought of every kid's least restrictive environment, where are they going to thrive? Where are they going to succeed? Where can their strengths most shine? Again, I will never ever say that self-directed learning is something for everyone, because it's a family decision. It's a decision that has to be made for the individual child. But I will say that we need to stop more and look at individual kids and what they need and what the best environment for learning is for them.
It feels like that's one of the great lessons of special education. Are there other lessons that special education professionals know about learning?
Gosh, I mean, yes, right? So I'm an educational psychologist. I didn't come into this field as a special educator, and now I run, and I love it. It's the best job in the world, this adolescent special education program. And, I say to my kids who are adults, just like your kids are your kids, my kids are my kids. I came into special ed because I attached to and know the strength of an IEP, an individualized education program that outlines literally on paper, on a legal document, here's the strengths, here's the needs, here's what we're going to do for them, here's the goals, here's the objectives, and here's like plans for transition. Here's the discussion of when a kid grows up, what happens next. When you do an IEP well, there's no more important document in all of the world. There's also that lesson, of course, we talked about least restrictive environment, which again, I think is a term that can grow. But there's also the lesson in differentiation, differentiated learning, which is a core special ed process, right? We take learning and we differentiate it in a multisensory way to reach the individual kid. There's a gift there. That differentiated learning process is, if it can be done for every kid, then you've got a great environment for learning. So I think it really lies in the IEP, the notion of least restrictive environment, that notion of differentiation, universal design, and then, of course, that planning for transition to
Is,
adulthood.
is there a good resource for parents to go through the process of creating an IEP for their child?
I love the work of um, understood.org. Now, understood.org is a special education resource. It really is. But there's a lot of wonderful examples of IEPs there. There's a lot of talk of really holistic education there. And so understood.org is a great resource. So you can look at samples of IEPs, and then whether your kid has special needs or not, you can take those examples and sort of replicate them for your own child, just to really see, again, here's the strengths, here's the needs, let's create goals, and let's create some, transition plans. Understood.org is my favorite, but there are lots of other websites out there that are incredible. UDL for Teachers is really interesting if you're a teacher and interested in universal design for learning. I love the site UDL for Teachers. It really just explains what universal design is and explains how you can take it and utilize it in your classroom space. So there are lots of resources out there, and it's just all about finding the one that works for you.
Okay, wonderful. Any final advice to parents and students who find themselves a little lost at this time?
Take time to really, really investigate strengths and interests. The pandemic has been something where we've seen people get really into their hobbies, get really into what they love doing. And there will be a post pandemic. And I hope that parents and teachers and kids will remember what the feeling was when they did things that they loved, even for a little while, what that felt like. And then my hope is they get to replicate that in their post pandemic lives. That feeling of intrinsic motivation, that feeling of doing what you love, and that feeling of the strength and competence that comes from that.